Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 15th meeting of the committee in 2021. Agenda item 1 is for the committee to decide whether consideration of its draft report should be taken in private at future meetings. Does the committee agree? Thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item 2, which is our main public business today, and is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints. And we will hear from the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, MSP. At the outset, can I note for members, for the First Minister and for all those watching this evidence session at home, that due to the necessary mitigations in place to allow us to meet in person today, we will be suspending the meeting periodically to allow for the room to be ventilated and cleaned. And our first suspension will be around 11 a.m. I would also note for those watching that every effort has been made to make this in-person evidence session as safe as possible for all involved, including social distancing around the table and committee room. Can I remind members of the committee and media representatives to continue to observe social distancing when entering and leaving the committee room? As I have said at the outset of every meeting, I would remind all those present and watching that we are bound by the terms of our remit and the relevant court orders, including the need to avoid contempt of court by identifying certain individuals, including through jigsaw identification. The committee as a whole has agreed that it is not our role to revisit events that were a focus of the trial that could be seen to constitute a rerun of the criminal trial. Our remit is clear, and it is to consider and report on the actions of the First Minister, Scottish Government officials and special advisers in dealing with complaints about Alex Salmond, former First Minister. Considered under the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints involving current or former ministers and procedure and actions in relation to the Scottish Ministerial Code. The more we get into specifics of evidence, that is time, people, cases, the more we run the risk of identifying those who made complaints. The more we ask about specific matters covered in the trial, including events explored in the trial, the more we run the risk of rerunning the trial. In questions, reference to specific dates and individuals should be avoided, and questions should be phrased in general terms where possible to avoid the risk of jigsaw identification of complainants. In addition, please do not refer to civil servants by name unless absolutely necessary, and do not refer to civil servants by name if they are below senior civil service level. I would also emphasise that the committee would be content to receive written supplementary points should any witness to this inquiry have concerns that their response may stray into this territory. Given the number of documents and complaints handling, for ease of reference when asking a question, please mention the document number, footnote reference and whether it is in batch 1 or 2. With that, can I welcome the First Minister of Scotland, and I begin by inviting Ms Sturgeon to make the affirmation. Would you please raise your right hand, First Minister, and repeat after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, and I would now ask the First Minister to make an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Convener. The spotlight shone on historic workplace harassment in late 2017 was long overdue. It was absolutely right at that time for my government to review its processes, consider any weaknesses and gaps in them, and put in place a procedure that would allow complaints, including those of a historic nature, to be investigated. When complaints were made about Alex Salmond, it was also absolutely right that the government took them seriously and subjected them to investigation. An individual's profile, status or connections should not result in complaints of this nature being ignored or swept under the carpet. That, in this case, it was a former First Minister, does not change that. The procedure that was adopted in late 2017 in the wake of the Me Too concerns was drafted by civil servants, largely independently of me. However, I was kept abreast of its development and I did sign it off. As a result of a mistake that was made, a very serious mistake in the investigation of the complaints against Alex Salmond, 2 women were failed and taxpayers' money was lost. I deeply regret that. Although I was not aware of the error at the time, I am the head of the Scottish Government, and so I want to take this opportunity to say sorry to the 2 women involved and to the wider public. I also accept without any reservation that my actions deserve to be scrutinised. 2 years ago, I volunteered for such scrutiny by referring matters relating to my contact with Alex Salmond to the independent advisor on the Ministerial Code, James Hamilton. Mr Hamilton is conducting an independent investigation and I await his findings. His investigation is not being conducted in public, though of course his conclusions will be published. As a result of that, he is able to hear and consider material that, because of a contempt of court order, this committee cannot, including, as I understand it, from people who were actually party to discussions that others who were not party to those discussions are seeking to attest to. Mr Hamilton has offered no commentary on his investigation, and nor will I. However, this committee and the public are entitled to hear from me directly on the matters under consideration. So today I will do my best to answer every question asked of me directly and in as much detail as I can. Firstly, on the 8th of January 2019, I volunteered to Parliament my contact with Alex Salmond. I stated as follows. On 2nd April 2018, he informed me about the complaints against him. I will explain why I stand by that statement. Second, I will set out why I did not immediately record the April 2nd meeting within the Scottish Government, a decision based entirely on my desire to protect the independence and the confidentiality of the process. Thirdly, I will outline why I believe it was right that I did not intervene in the investigation when I became aware of it, even though Alex Salmond asked me to do so. And finally, although the mistake made in the conduct of the investigation meant ultimately that the action for judicial review could not be defended, I will demonstrate that the decisions taken at each stage of it were legally sound. I'm sure we will return to all of these matters in detail. However, I want to focus in these opening remarks on the issues around my contact with Alex Salmond on 2nd April and my contact 3 days earlier with his former Chief of Staff. Alec has claimed in his testimony to the committee that the meeting in my home on the 2nd of April took place with a shared understanding on the part of all the participants of the issues for discussion. In other words, that he turned up to the meeting believing I already knew everything. I think it's worth noting, even just in passing, that this in fact represents a change in his position. On the 14th of January 2019, after the conclusion of the judicial review, a spokesperson issued this comment on his behalf. Alec has no certainty as to the state of knowledge of the First Minister before then, by which he meant the 2nd of April. A brief account of what happened on the 2nd of April suggests, as per his comment in January 2019, that he did not assume full knowledge on my part in advance. When he arrived at my house, he was insistent that he speak to me entirely privately, away from his former Chief of Staff, Jeff Aberdeen, and Duncan Hamilton, who had accompanied him, and my Chief of Staff, who was with me. That would have seemed unnecessary had there already been a shared understanding on the part of all of us. He then asked me to read a letter he had received from the Permanent Secretary. This letter set out the fact that complaints of sexual harassment had been made against him by 2 individuals. It made clear that these complaints were being investigated under the procedure adopted at the end of 2017, and it set out the details of what he was alleged to have done. Reading this letter is a moment in my life that I will never forget. And although he denied the allegations, he gave me his account of one of the incidents complained of, which he said he had apologised for at the time. What he described constituted, in my view, deeply inappropriate behaviour on his part, perhaps another reason why that moment is embedded so strongly in my mind. At the time he was showing me the letter and outlining his account, Jeff and Duncan were doing the same with my Chief of Staff. Again, this would seem unnecessary had she and I known everything in advance. Questions have been raised about a conversation I had 3 days earlier on 29th March 2018 with Jeff Aberdeen and another individual. I've not seen Mr Aberdeen's own account of that conversation. However, I obviously know the account Mr Salmond has given of the meeting, although he also said on Friday that he had not been given a readout of it. Let me say up front that I have no wish to question the sincerity of Jeff's recollection. Jeff Aberdeen is somebody I remain extremely fond of. But it is clear that my recollection is different and that I did not and do not attach the same significance to that discussion that he has. The purpose of the conversation seemed to be to persuade me to meet with Alec as soon as possible, which I did agree to do in that conversation. Jeff did indicate that a harassment type issue had arisen, but my recollection is that he did so in general terms. Since an approach from Sky News in November 2017, and I mentioned this in my written evidence to the committee, I had harboured a lingering suspicion that such issues in relation to Mr Salmond might rear their head. So hearing of a potential issue would not have been in itself a massive shock. What I recall most strongly about the conversation is how worried Jeff seemed to be about Alec's welfare and state of mind, which, as a friend, concerned me. He also said he thought Alec might be considering resigning his party membership. It was these factors that led me to agree to meet him, and it was these factors that placed the meeting on the 2nd of April firmly in the personal and party space. Not unreasonably, at all. Some people have asked how I could have forgotten the conversation on 29th March, and I certainly wish my memory of it was more vivid. But as I have stated, it was the detail of the complaints under the procedure that I was given on 2nd April that was significant and indeed shocking. That was the moment at which any suspicions I had or general awareness that there was a problem became actual and detailed knowledge. It's also worth saying that even if I had known on 29th March everything I learned on 2nd April, my actions wouldn't necessarily have been different. Given what I was told about the distress Alec was in and how it was suggested to me that he might be intending to handle matters, it is likely that I would still have agreed to meet him as a friend and as his party leader. And as I also set out in written evidence, my decision not to record the meeting on 2nd April immediately wasn't about the classification I gave it, not about it being a party rather than a government meeting. It was because I did not want to compromise the independence or the confidentiality of the process underway. All of which begs the question of why I would have gone to great lengths to conceal a conversation that had taken place a mere 3 days earlier. Let me turn now to my decision to not immediately report the contact. Sections 4.22 and 4.23 of the Ministerial Code seek to guard against undisclosed outside influence on decisions that ministers are involved in and likely to have an influence on, such as changes in policy or the awarding of contracts. This situation, as I saw it, was the opposite of that. The terms of the procedure excluded me from any investigation into a former minister. I had no role in the process and should not even have known that an investigation was underway. So in my judgment, the undue influence that Section 4 is designed to avoid would have been more likely to arise had those conducting the investigation been informed that I knew about it. I didn't want to take the risk that they might be influenced, even subconsciously, by any assumption of how I might want the matter handled. Their ability to do the job independently would be best protected by me saying nothing. It's also my reading of the code that had I reported it, the fact of my meeting with Alex Salmond would have had to be made public, potentially breaching the confidentiality of the process. It was for those reasons that I did not immediately record the 2nd April meeting or the subsequent phone call on 23rd April in which Mr Salmond wanted me to tell the Permanent Secretary that I knew about the investigation and persuade her to agree to mediation. It is worth noting that the Ministerial Code places a number of obligations on ministers, and respect for the impartiality of civil servants and the confidentiality of government business are also obligations imposed on me by the Code. My judgment on that changed when Alex Salmond made it clear to me that he was seriously considering legal action. I felt then that I had no choice but to inform the Permanent Secretary, which I did on 6 June 2018. I also confirmed to her that I had no intention of intervening in the process, and I did not intervene in the process. Mr Salmond's anger at me for this, I think, is evident, but intervening in a process that I was expressly excluded from and trying on behalf of a close associate to change the course it might take would have been an abuse of my role. The committee is also rightly interested in the judicial review, and the government has now published legal advice that informed the decisions we took. It's clear from that advice that while the government had very strong prospects of defending Mr Salmond's initial challenge, that changed over a 2-month period from late October to late December. The concerns raised by counsel, caused by emerging evidence regarding the role of the investigating officer, undoubtedly caused me and others to pause to check if we should continue to defend the case. However, as late as December the 11th, the view of law officers following consultation with counsel was as follows. Very clear that no question or need to drop the case. The Lord Advocate clear that even if prospects are not certain, it is important that our case is heard. Senior counsel made clear that his note was not intended to convey that he didn't think we have a stateable case. They concluded that, including on the appointment of the investigating officer, and again I'm quoting, we have credible arguments to make across the petition. It was when that changed that the decision was taken to concede. In any legal challenge a government faces, there is a balance of risk. That risk cannot be eliminated, but the task of ministers is to consider carefully all of the advice we receive and consider the broader public interest. And the test in the Ministerial Code is not the view of external lawyers, but of law officers. Convener, finally, and you'll be glad to hear briefly, though I hope to say more as we get into questions, I feel I must rebut the absurd suggestion that anyone acted with malice or as part of a plot against Alex Salmond. That claim is not based in any fact. What happened is this, and it is simple. A number of women made serious complaints about Alex Salmond's behaviour. The government, despite the mistake it undoubtedly made, tried to do the right thing. As First Minister, I refused to follow the age-old pattern of allowing a powerful man to use his status and connections to get what he wants. The police conducted an independent criminal investigation. The Crown Office, as it does in prosecutions every single day of the week, considered the evidence and decided there was a case to answer. A court and a jury did their jobs. And now this committee and an independent investigation are considering what happened and why. For my part, I am, if not relishing the prospect, relieved to be finally facing this committee. But given all that has brought us to this moment, being here also makes me really sad, and in all the legitimate consideration of this, sometimes the personal and human elements of this situation are lost. Alex spoke on Friday about what a nightmare the last couple of years have been for him, and I don't doubt that. I have thought often about the impact on him. He was someone I cared about for a long time. And maybe that's why on Friday I found myself searching for any sign at all that he recognised how difficult this has been for others too. First and foremost for women who believed his behaviour towards them was inappropriate, but also for those of us who have campaigned with him, worked with him, cared for him and considered him a friend, and who now stand unfairly accused of plotting against him. That he was acquitted by a jury of criminal conduct is beyond question, beyond question. But I know, just from what he told me, that his behaviour was not always appropriate. And yet, across 6 hours of testimony, there was not a single word of regret, reflection, or even simple acknowledgement of that. I can only hope that, in private, the reality might be different. Today, though, is about my actions. I have never claimed in this or anything else to be infallible. I have searched my soul on all of this many, many times over. It may very well be that I didn't get everything right. That's for others to judge. But in one of the most invidious political and personal situations I have ever faced, I believe I acted properly and appropriately, and that overall I made the best judgments I could. For anyone, at least anyone willing to listen with an open mind, that is what I will seek to demonstrate today.
Thank you, First Minister. And we'll now go on to questions. Our committee and therefore our report is split into various sections. It's about the development and implementation of the policy, it's about the judicial review and, of course, the Ministerial Code. And we will attempt to chronologically go through that for ease of the session, although there will be crossovers, that's understandable. So can I ask the first question, please, about the new policy that was put in place, and ask you to give us an outline of the development process of that policy.
The genesis of the new policy was, of course, the Me Too revelations of late 2017. I don't need to go into detail for people around this table. This was something that rocked the UK, indeed rocked many parts of the world, something that began with very serious historic allegations about people in the entertainment and media business very quickly became something that gripped the political system here in the UK. There were allegations about sexual harassment, including historic sexual harassment at Westminster. And then in late October, and I'm sure everybody around this table vividly remembers this, there were allegations, I think it was mainly in the Sunday Herald at the time, about allegations of sexual harassment in this institution and a concern that there were not proper processes in place to allow those to come forward, and that people, women, didn't have the confidence to bring complaints forward. So that is the backdrop. I wrote to the presiding officer, I believe on the Monday after that story, to suggest cross-party discussions. They took place the following day, as I recall. And the Cabinet that morning, as I believe the UK government was doing or had been doing, had a discussion about this and decided that we should review our processes. We didn't decide what the outcome of that review should be, but we decided that it was right, given the concerns that had been raised about lack of processes, or at least lack of processes that people had confidence in, that that should happen. That was a commission that was given by Cabinet to the senior civil service. The Deputy First Minister indicated that to Parliament, I believe that afternoon, I think it was, I took part in discussions in the presiding officer's room here with representatives of other parties. And I think it's fair to say at that time all parties were reviewing their processes as well. I know my party was and did. You've heard evidence, I know, from senior civil servants who were very involved in this work. They did an assessment of the gaps. There's been discussion about a route map that they had prepared. Early drafts of the procedure were prepared. The inclusion of former ministers, because one of the gaps that had been identified was the inability to, under our existing processes, to investigate or address historic complaints. The inclusion of former ministers was there from the outset. It hadn't been expressly requested by me or by the Cabinet. That was something that was included because it was perceived to be a gap. The procedure then went through an iterative process of drafting and redrafting and changes. I think I would probably summarise 3 key policy changes that took place over that period from early November to me signing off the policy on 20th of December. Firstly, that current ministers came to be added into it. The view being, as I understand it, that it made sense to have all ministers dealt with in the same procedure. Secondly, at a later stage, I think around mid to late November, a First Minister's role in effectively having a sort of gateway part of the process of deciding with the Permanent Secretary whether an investigation should be triggered was removed, so that that was something the Permanent Secretary could decide on her own, and a First Minister wouldn't have any role in that decision. And given this was a procedure about politicians or former politicians, I thought that was appropriate. And then finally, the change that was made towards the end of the development, closer to me signing it off, was that in the case of former ministers, a First Minister should not be told about the investigation or the outcome until the end of that process. I noted Alex saying on Friday that he couldn't understand why that was the case for former ministers and not current ministers. I have to confess to being quite astounded that a former First Minister wouldn't understand that distinction. The reason why, and to be perfectly frank, my preference would have been, given that this was about politicians or ex-politicians, for that to have been the case overall. But for current ministers, it's important that a First Minister knows of any concerns that have been raised, because you have an ongoing duty to decide whether somebody continues to be fit to hold office. So that is the reason for that distinction. That's a summary account, Convener, but I'm happy to go into any detail on any of these aspects that members wish.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that will be the case. And I go first of all to Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, First Minister. I wonder if I can take you back to when the inquiry was announced, and that was in January 2019. And you said at that point, I will answer any question to the fullest extent possible, that my government will cooperate fully with all inquiries. The inquiries will be able to request whatever material they want. And I undertake today that we will provide whatever material they request. Why didn't that happen, First Minister?
Ms Mitchell, I consider that has happened. Now, I concede at the outset that this committee has been frustrated at not being able to access certain information that it wanted to access, and I readily acknowledge that. Some of that is information and material that is not within the control or the gift of the Scottish Government, and I think I will go into that because the committee knows the different categories here. The Scottish Government has made available to this committee copious amounts of information in terms of written information, documents, written material, and of course civil servants and now me today are giving evidence orally. The main issue of difference between the government and the committee, and I recognise this and I recognise the different views that exist, is around legal advice. And there is a long-standing convention that governments do not release publicly their legal advice. And it's not a convention that is in place for no good reason. As a minister of some long-standing now, it is really important for the governance of the country and to ensure that ministers are able to base their decisions on the best advice possible, open and frank advice, that exists. Because otherwise, if you had a situation where legal advice was routinely published, lawyers may start to fashion their advice with that in mind. So it's a convention that is important, and it's not just one that the Scottish Government adheres to, it's one that many governments, as I understand it, adhere to. So that has been the basis for that decision. The Lord Advocate, of course, has sat before this committee and shared very openly the decision-making process around the judicial review and the factors that were taken into account by the government at different stages of consideration. There was also an agreement, I know, that the Deputy First Minister reached with the committee about sharing some information privately, but also some information that was allowed to be shared publicly, effectively a summation of the legal advice. So we have sought to try, within the constraints of that convention, to make information available to the committee. I appreciate the committee was not satisfied with that, and that, coupled with some of the, in my view, completely unfounded allegations that have been made about the basis for decisions that people were taking, and particularly allegations that were being made around motives and factors in the consideration of the judicial review, we decided yesterday to release the legal advice, and the substantial legal advice has been released. I think the committee has been told there may be other material that we can release later, but the committee can now look at the Council's opinions that were given to the government, can track the changing prospects of the government, but also crucially, as I read out in my initial remarks, can see that up until well into December, the view of law officers was that it was appropriate that we continued to defend the case. And I'm sure as we come on to the judicial review later, I can go into more detail about why exactly that was the case.
Openness, transparency and accountability is essential for any government to maintain trust. But the Deputy First Minister has refused to allow the calculation of the costs of the Scottish Government Legal Department spent on the judicial review. That's likely to bring the total cost much nearer to £1 million than the 500 or 6,000 often quoted. He refused, as you've already explained, to release external legal advice that it was clearly in the public interest to do, and only did so as late as yesterday when he faced a vote of no confidence. But most frustrating for this committee has been the fact that despite us meeting 2 years, while we couldn't meet in public, we did all the groundwork in private to ensure that when we did meet last year in the summer, The government knew exactly the information we needed, required, and had already provided some of it. Despite this, in December 2000 last year, 23rd of December, 288 complaint handling documents were sent to this committee, asked for at least 6 months before. And more generally, we face delay, obstruction, obfuscation, and still not received some information that is crucial to our inquiry carrying out its remit. Is that acceptable, First Minister?
Clearly, in the terms you've just put it, Ms Mitchell, it would not be acceptable, but you'll not be surprised to hear that while I understand the frustration, and I'll come on to perhaps share some of that frustration, I would not accept the characterisation. And I'll say this just as a statement of fact, it's not in any way meant to say that I'm not going to attempt to answer the question. At the outset of this investigation, and members are aware of this, I recused myself from the government's handling of it because I thought that was appropriate, given that I am the subject of, at least in part, the subject of the investigation. The government has made available substantial amounts of written and oral evidence. If there are, I'm not aware of what you are referring to that is within the government's control that you still feel that we haven't handed over. If that is, it hasn't already been made known to the government. If it can be, then I'm sure there will be attempts made to rectify that. But within the constraints that we operate within, I've already talked about the position with legal advice, but of course there are also court orders in place here, and there is a very elaborate and substantial process that the government has had to go through to release information in line with all of its legal obligations. And I know the committee understands that because the committee has often had to go through that as well. There are other elements of information that it has been claimed the committee hasn't had when it should have done, and you know, that's for the committee to address, but they are not within the control of the government. Obviously, there is material that is restricted in terms of what can be published. I'm not sure it's restricted in terms of what the committee can consider because of a contempt of court order, and there is the matter of information that was handed over in the course of a criminal trial, and I know the committee's had extensive deliberations with other witnesses about that, but there is no intention on the part of the government. When you say these things to me as First Minister, I've got to take that seriously, but there's no intention on the part of the government to withhold relevant information from this committee. The final point I would make here, which is part where I will share some of the frustration, as you know, and I should say, I understand why this is the case, so it's not intended to be, in case there's any suggestion that it is a criticism of the committee. I have waited a long, long time to be sitting here myself, while allegations and claims have been swirling around about me without me having the ability to address them. And as information that has been claimed was devastating to the government's position and proved all sorts of things has come to light, including information that this committee has seen, it has proved to be nothing of the sort. And therefore, I suppose there is also frustration on my part where information is not known to the committee. Often what is suggested about it bears very little relation to the reality of it. And therefore, what I would say is the more about this, within all the legal constraints that none of us can magic away, I want as much of this to be known out there and public, because while the government made mistakes, and we'll come on to those, there's nothing here that the government has to hide.
You mentioned, First Minister, that you've been frustrated waiting 2 years to give evidence. Most of us here have been in exactly the same position and more frustrated because the delay has been fairly and squarely because the government hasn't provided the information it could have had when it had. But let me turn to your submission. You say, as First Minister, I wanted to ensure that the Scottish Government had robust procedures in place to allow any concerns or complaints by those in its employment to be properly and fairly considered. That hasn't happened, First Minister. Why do you think that's the case?
It didn't happen in the case of the two complaints that we're considering here because the government made a mistake, and a very serious mistake, in how it applied the procedure to the investigation into Alex Salmond. And as I said, I think in Parliament the day the judicial review was conceded, and I've said again today, I deeply regret that. Those words don't do justice to how I feel about that. I feel sorry for it. I feel very angry about it, and I'm not going to try and suggest otherwise. That's what went wrong. The procedure itself, and again, we'll come back to this no doubt when we talk about the judicial review, one of the reasons why, even when the prospects were not as strong as they had been at the outset, the government wanted to continue with the judicial review, was that a number of attacks, legal attacks and challenges had been made on the procedure itself, on the lawfulness and appropriateness of the procedure. We thought and think that the procedure is lawful and sound. The procedure itself has never been declared unlawful, despite what Mr Salmond was trying to suggest to you on Friday. And we wanted, given the challenges that had been directed to the procedure, we wanted to find out through a court process whether they were justified or not, because this was, again, despite some suggestions to the contrary, this was not a procedure that was put in place for Alex Salmond. This is a procedure that we intended to be in operation and is still in operation so that anybody who had complaints against ministers or former ministers could, if they wanted to, use it. So there was a legitimate public interest in determining whether any of these fundamental challenges to its essential lawfulness were justified. Now, you heard Alex say on Friday that his legal advice said that he had really good prospects. You've seen now the initial note on prospects from the Scottish Government, where the Scottish Government was confident that it could successfully defend and rebut all of these challenges. The fact is, we don't know who would have prevailed in that, because the judicial review, entirely down to the mistake the government made in the application of the procedure, it didn't get to that stage. But what went wrong, Ms Mitchell, and you will not get me today in any way trying to sugarcoat or shy away from this. The government made a serious error around the appointment of the investigating officer, and that's, of course, something that, as well as this committee looking into, Laura Dunlop QC is carrying out an independent internal investigation for the government.
Can I merely comment that to refer to this as a mistake or a serious error, somewhat disingenuous? If you could let me finish, First Minister. The judicial review made it quite clear in Lord Pentland's order that the process was unlawful and it was tainted with bias. But that's for others to go into. Just to concentrate now on your role as Deputy First Minister under fairness to work. In your submission, you said, I had no general concerns from 2008 to 2014. When you as Deputy First Minister had a key role in that procedure then, can you outline just exactly what that involved? And if it ever occurred to you then that the very high bar that was put in place in 2010 when the new Fairness to Work came into operation, that in order to make a formal complaint, the complainants had to put that in writing. And we know that these complaints, given the timescale, were against SNP ministers. That's a very high bar, First Minister, given it's someone so powerful, given it the effects potentially in career prospects. Did it ever occur to you that that wasn't the best way to encourage people to come forward and to have their complaints resolved?
Firstly, before I answer that, Ms Mitchell, I am not seeking to be disingenuous in my description of the error. Error, mistake, if there is a better word, I'm happy to use it. I am not defending it. I am deeply regretful, deeply angry, and will always feel incredibly bad for principally the two women who were let down because of that, and also because of the wider implications in terms of cost to the taxpayer. So I apologise if I'm not using vocabulary that properly gets that across, but I hope you will take at face value that I am not trying to underplay that in any way, shape or form. And just to complete the point, the procedure itself, and I recognise it's a long time since I practiced law, but I do recognise the interchangeability of terminology sometimes confuses the situation. The procedure itself has not been declared unlawful. Now, had the judicial review proceeded, who knows? Maybe it would have been. We were confident it wouldn't be, but we don't know that because the judicial review didn't proceed. The application of it, which is perhaps what people talk about when they say the process, was flawed, and the terminology you've used, tainted by apparent bias, is exactly what the court said in its interlocutor. But that distinction between the lawfulness of the process and the flaw in the application of it, I think, is one that is important to bear in mind. On fairness at work, I heard Alex talk about the length of time it had taken to develop that policy. I had I suppose, a wry smile when I heard him say how, or suggest how involved he would have been in that. That's, I have to say, not my memory of the situation, but we won't. That's me going off at a tangent. It was developed with a lot of input, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was intimately involved in every aspect of the development of that policy. I certainly don't recall that being the case, but it was developed over a period of time with input from trade unions and others. Nothing was formally brought to me under the role, the Deputy First Minister, which back then was me under that, and I think you've heard evidence to that effect from others. Did I, and this probably is something I would reflect on myself, did I spend that much time thinking about whether fairness at work was fit for purpose back then? No, I didn't, and maybe I should have done. And that's perhaps one of the lessons I have to learn out of this. But it was because, if we go back to late October 2017, in the wake of Me Too, it was a general sense that people didn't think current processes were fit for purpose that led us to review these processes. And one of the things that I think led to a distinct standalone procedure was exactly what you're saying, that there's a lot of focus on fairness at work in informal resolution, on mediation, and perhaps the bar is too high in terms of when things get to formal complaints, and also perhaps that kind of approach is not entirely appropriate when you're dealing with sexual harassment allegations. And I think I do have it somewhere, but I don't have it in front of me right now. I think Fairness at Work, for example, cites one of the ways in which, or one of the circumstances in which mediation is not appropriate is where there is a significant power imbalance. So I'm not going to sit here and say, I think everything about fairness at work is perfect, but it was developed with a lot of input from trade unions, and it is a policy that remains in place.
I'm conscious of time, but all I would say, First Minister, it was entirely in your remit as the Deputy First Minister to look at these complaints, to look at it in an informal stage. And were you aware that there had been complaints raised, all predominantly from females? And you've certainly always set yourself up as someone who was a champion for women's issues, and yet you didn't pay that much attention to it.
I was not, and again, I think you've heard evidence from others. I was not aware, and we'll come on to when I did become aware of things, but before the November 2017 media query that came from Sky News about Edinburgh Airport, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later, I was not aware of allegations or concerns about sexually inappropriate behaviour on the part of Alex Salmond. And that is just...
First Minister. It's generally, it was 5 SNP ministers. And can I remind you, Alex Salmond is a key witness to this inquiry. He's not under trial. Your actions are. And if you could focus on that,
sorry,
that would be much appreciated.
My apologies. I was saying I hadn't heard anything, so I wasn't putting him on trial for that. I don't... forgive me, Ms Mitchell, I don't know exactly what you are referring to in terms of 5 SNP ministers. So if that's something that I can, be given in more detail, I'm happy to respond to it, but I don't know right now what it is you're referring to. Nothing came to me as Deputy First Minister under the Fairness at Work policy in terms of the role that the Deputy First Minister had and still has. In terms of more general concerns about section, not in relation to any one individual, have I for my entire working life been aware of problems of sexual harassment and sexism and misogyny? You bet I have. But to say that that means that things were brought to me or that there were things that I could have acted upon back then that I didn't, that's not the same thing.
Just for reference, it'll be my last.
Could you give the reference to where it comes from?
I'll just say, in reflecting back to this is the FDA. In reflecting back the last 10 years, we are aware of approaches on behalf of around 30 members in relation to at least 5 ministerial offices. So that was 5 SNP ministerial offices. You're happy to look at that, and I'm glad to pass it over to you at any time.
Give me the reference. I apologise. I have not been able to watch all of the evidence that has been given to the committee. I've tried to read as much of it as I could before coming here today, so I recognise now the reference you're talking about. These were not things that were brought to me at the time under Fairness at Work, and you know that means that there is not much beyond what I've already said that I can usefully say on these matters. If you're asking me, does that concern me? Of course, I don't want to be in a position I wouldn't have back then, and I certainly don't now, where people in government feel that they have any need, formally or informally, to complain about behaviours in ministerial offices.
Thank you.
We go on, please, to Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, First Minister. I'd like to concentrate on the creation of the new procedure in the light of the Me Too movement. When he gave evidence, Mr Salmond questioned whether there was any need to create a new procedure. Instead of, he questioned why Fairness at Work wasn't simply edited to strengthen the criteria to include sexual harassment. Why did the government take a decision to create a new procedure rather than tinker with the old one?
As I heard Alex's evidence on Friday, and I may be being unfair to him here, he seemed to be saying he didn't think there should have been a procedure in place that was capable of investigating him, because he didn't think that there should have been, or if there had been a procedure about allowed investigation of historic allegations, it should have taken 18 months or so to put in place. And that is what struck me in terms of that section of his evidence, that his view was it not just that the complaints against him shouldn't have been investigated, but that it should have been impossible to investigate them because there should have been no procedure that allowed it to happen. I fundamentally disagree with that, and I know the committee pursued this line of questioning and has with others. You know, this Parliament, in fact, I think it comes to stage 3 sometime over the next few days, is changing its procedures to allow historic complaints against MSPs to be investigated. Why did we decide to... well, firstly, in light of Me Too, we took a decision, the Cabinet took a decision on the 31st of October to review its procedures. It didn't take that decision with a preconceived notion of what the outcome of that review should be. We gave the civil service an open commission to review procedures. I think, given, and I know, you know, we're talking about this with the passage of some time, but given the profile of the Me Too revelations, given how much attention organisations the world over were doing this at that time, it would have been not just remiss of us not to do it. I'm pretty sure it would have attracted substantial criticism had we not done that. So that's the first point. And secondly, as that process started and as the gaps and weaknesses in current procedures were identified, the view was that a standalone process that allowed current or former ministers and allowed expressly historic allegations to be investigated was appropriate. I think some of the points Margaret Mitchell made to me about the setting of the bar in Fairness at Work and some of the focus in Fairness at Work on informal resolution and mediation, I think was also part of a consideration about whether that was appropriate for the kind of complaints that we were seeking to put a procedure in place to deal with.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, much has been made about the time difference between Fairness at Work being devised over 18 months or so and the relative shortness of time of the new policy. Was that something that you encouraged to happen, that you wanted it done very quickly?
Again, I go back to the climate at the time and the sort of, for want of a better expression, the sort of consensus of opinion that there was a big problem here, not just in Scotland or the UK, but globally, about an inability for women who felt they'd experienced sexual harassment to come forward, a lack of confidence on their part coming forward, and part of those concerns was a perception that it was particularly difficult to investigate allegations of historic harassment. So, yes, we felt we had a big problem, not just us, but we had to contend with and to address a problem that people thought was a serious one. So if you said to me back then, if the Permanent Secretary or the senior civil servants who were tasked with the drafting of this procedure, had they come to me then, which they didn't, so I'm kind of speculating here, but if they come to me then and said, First Minister, this is going to take 18 months, I would probably have said, get out of here and do it more quickly than that, because that's not an acceptable period of time when this is a serious problem that we need to try to address. So yes, it was something we wanted to do quickly, not cutting corners or doing it in any way inappropriately. There was trade union involvement, as I think the committee has heard. In fact, before I signed it off on the 20th of December, I had made sure that the trade unions had been involved. So it wasn't a policy that there wasn't a lot of consideration given to. There was, but it was a policy that I think for good reason we wanted to have in place sooner rather than later.
And under the Fairness at Work procedure, mediation is an option available in the cases of complaints against current ministers. So why is there a difference between mediation available to current ministers but not in relation to former ministers, do you think?
Well, Fairness at Work only applies to current ministers. Mediation is an option there. There is, I think, an open question that people will have different views on about whether mediation is always an appropriate procedure in cases of sexual harassment and in cases where there is a significant power imbalance. I also think for mediation to be a reasonable process, there has to be consent to that on both sides. But there isn't a distinction between current and former ministers and Fairness at Work, because Fairness at Work applies only to current ministers. In terms of the procedure which applies to current and former ministers, there isn't an express mediation provision in the procedure for current ministers. There is a reference, I think, from memory, I'm sure this will be noted if I'm quoting the wrong paragraph here, I think from memory paragraph 6 has a reference to seeing whether there's any prospect of resolving things, which is not in the part of the procedure for former ministers, but that's not an express mediation provision. And, why is there that in one and not the other? I'm not sure I can fully answer that, and it's maybe something that, as we review all of this, and Lauded and Locke's report will be part of that, we want to think further about. I suppose if I was to offer any thought, is that with a current minister, you're more likely to be talking about people who are still working together, maybe if there's an opportunity to resolve something because it has genuinely been a misunderstanding, then that is a provision that should be there. With a former minister, it's somebody who's not still in the workplace, so perhaps that is not seen to be as appropriate, but that is perhaps an aspect that we will want to think about as we complete these reviews, or that review.
It's clear from our evidence that prior to the introduction of the procedure, complaints were sometimes handled informally. For example, we heard from Dave Penman that, of the Civil Servants Union, that he talked about concerns about instances being handled informally. For example, staff were moved on so that they wouldn't have to work with the minister or the person that they complained about. Do you think that was, or sometimes people could give an apology, do you think that that was a satisfactory way of dealing with complaints or concerns?
So I think I'd answer that two ways. Sometimes that will be a satisfactory way of dealing with a particular complaint, because it will be satisfactory to the person who's complaining. They will prefer to have it dealt with informally. An apology might suffice. So I wouldn't say that it's never appropriate for that to be the approach that is taken. The second point I would make, though, perhaps goes back to Margaret Mitchell's questions to me. And the fact that, Margaret Mitchell is reading out evidence to me that says there were complaints, concerns from trade unions about a number of ministerial offices. And at the time, as Deputy First Minister, who had a role in fairness at work, that never came to me. So that does raise a question in my mind, to use Margaret's terminology: is the bar set too high, or is there an over-reliance on informal resolution? And is it the case, and I'm posing this as a question rather than a fixed view, but it is certainly a question in my mind, is there, or was there, an over-reliance on informal procedures, so that certain things that perhaps should have become more formalised and be dealt with in a different way were not? And I think that is a legitimate question to be asked of the government, and it's certainly a legitimate one for us to reflect on.
Can you tell us if this policy or procedure was discussed at Cabinet, and how often, during the iteration of the process of drawing up this new procedure, was discussed at Cabinet?
It wasn't discussed particularly at Cabinet. I'd have to check Cabinet minutes to see, how many times, if at all, it was. We have a thing which you'll be aware of at Cabinet called scans, which is just, things that ministers have to bring. It doesn't have a full Cabinet paper, but things that, and it may be that it was raised under that. The Permanent Secretary, kept me updated in terms of how the development of the policy, the procedure was progressing. I think the first draft of it I got sent was towards the end of November, and at that point, I think that was at the point where the role of the First Minister in effectively being a bit of a gatekeeper with the Permanent Secretary's complaints had been removed. I had, before that, the 22nd of November, I had formally written to the Permanent Secretary, because there was a view that, given that not just former ministers but current ministers had been included, the interrelationship that then created with the Ministerial Code meant that there should be express ministerial authority for the procedure being developed in that way. And then, of course, I ultimately signed it off on the 20th of December.
And a couple more questions, Convener. At the time of the commissioning of this new procedure, were you aware of any concerns being raised about the behaviour of any current or former minister?
At the time we commissioned it on the 31st of October, no. As I said in my written evidence, and as we'll no doubt come on to, I became aware through a media inquiry of an allegation about the former First Minister some days after that, at the start of November.
And did that influence the way you looked at the policy?
No. Sorry, my apologies.
It's okay. And just finally, do you think the policy which related to the civil service should have been discussed in Parliament, as somebody suggested?
I'll come on to the Parliament bit in a minute. I was maybe a bit too quick. I was definitely a bit too quick to answer there, because that's obviously one of the suggestions that's been made, that this policy was somehow a bespoke Alex Salmond policy, and even in the days when we were besties, Alex Salmond has a tendency to see most things being in some way about him, and I hope he takes that in the spirit it's intended. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. And I think to see it in that way really ignores what was happening globally at that time. This was about the Me Too revelations. Now, you ask, did the Sky thing then influence my views on it? No, it didn't. I think the danger, and I can't say there was no subconscious kind of thing in my mind about that, but the danger, I think, then would have been had I started to influence the development of this policy in a way that somehow protected him. If I'd taken my red pen or black pen as it is just now, and gone like that with former ministers, because I had this you know, this Sky thing had put a lingering suspicion in my mind, then I think I would legitimately be sitting here right now getting a lot of criticism. I didn't do that. The policy was not put in place because of Alex Salmond, but nor did I allow any, even subconscious, I hope, considerations about Alex Salmond to influence the decisions I took on that.
And just a question about whether you think these should have been debated in Parliament.
I think no would be the answer to that at the time. I mean, now, yeah, I don't know what would have happened had it been debated in Parliament. To the best of my knowledge and recollection, and I will be corrected on this if I'm wrong, I don't think fairness at work was ever debated in Parliament. These are HR policies, and the procedure is fundamentally an HR policy. And I don't think it would have been appropriate for it to be debated in Parliament. Similarly, you know, in a way that obviously Parliament is legislating in terms of the situation with investigating former MSPs, but that's because of the legislative underpinning of the standards process. The idea that you would have legislated for a government HR process or even debated it in Parliament, I think is something very different.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think Andy Wightman has some questions on the development of the policy.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, First Minister. You've said quite clearly that you had received no concerns about Mr Salmond's any alleged behaviour by Mr Salmond before the Sky News inquiry. One of the civil servants whose complaint ended up in the court, in fact, said to the journalist Danny Garavelli, if I'd complained, it wouldn't have been swept under the carpet and I would have suffered in my career. I never saw anyone in a senior position in the Scottish Government tackle the First Minister on his behaviour. You reflected a moment ago about whether it might have been better had you been more aware, for example, of the concerns expressed about 5 ministerial offices. Is the fact that civil servants in the Scottish Government have had concerns, may indeed currently continue to have concerns, something that you will now take more seriously in the aftermath of all of this?
Yes, but I hope it is the case that I have taken it seriously previously. Yeah, I made a comment in opening remarks about soul searching on this, and these are aspects that I have deeply thought about in the wake of this, and I want to try and briefly, because I know time is marching on, but I want to try and sort of unpack your question a little bit. I did not know, you know, so I now know there was an incident that Alex Salmond apologised to somebody for back in 2013. I did not know that at the time. I did not know of any concerns about Alex Salmond's sexual behaviour back then. Sorry, alleged. I am not.
Yes.
I am not.
Yes, please be careful with your words.
I'm sorry,
First Minister.
I did not hear concerns about that back then. You know, part of me wishes I had. If there had been concerns, I'm not saying they would have been well-founded, but I didn't. If you ask me, and I think I referred to this briefly in my written submission, Alec, like many people can be, so I'm not particularly singling him out other than that this is the basis of the question. He was a tough guy to work for. He could be very challenging to work for. If Alec was displeased with you, he would make that pretty obvious. And there were times where I did challenge his behaviour in that respect, when I witnessed situations where I thought he had or was perhaps risking crossing a line. But one of the things I have thought about is whether those of us who had worked very closely with Alec for a long, long time had become a bit inured to that kind of behaviour, and I'm talking about that, not anything allegedly sexual, and whether we had a higher threshold for that than perhaps people in government in 2007 had. So is that something I think about and thought about? Yes. Do I want to have a situation where anybody inside government who feels that they are being unfairly treated by any minister on any basis and in any way feels that they have the confidence to come forward and that their concerns will be treated seriously, absolutely. And I will continue to try to do what I can to make sure that that is the case.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask a fairly basic question? You say in your written evidence, for example, that you recognise that organisations too often closed ranks in defence of men accused of inappropriate behaviour, and that it could be particularly difficult for, quotes, historic allegations to be raised. You've mentioned historic allegations a number of times this morning. Can you just be clear what you mean by historic allegations? Because on the pedantic meaning, obviously all allegations relate to something that happened in the past. Could you be clear about what you mean by that?
It's often the basic questions that are the hardest to answer. I'm not entirely sure I'm going to give you a completely technical answer to this, because it's a good question that I possibly haven't thought about enough. I suppose what I mean, thinking about it in the moment, is that you have people, and in the context of sexual harassment allegations, it tends to be men rather than women. You have men in positions of authority or power or status over the people that are complaining, which makes it difficult for them to bring those complaints forward at the time the person they're complaining about is in that position of power or status or authority. And it can be only when they are no longer in that position that somebody can feel able to come forward. So I suppose in a general sense, that is partly what I mean by historic. Once the individual be complained of is not in the position that they were in, that was perhaps the inhibitor to the complaints coming forward. It probably has other potential meanings as well, but I think in broad terms, that's what I mean.
Okay, could I, in relation to that, ask you the same question I asked of Mr. Salmond on Friday? Do you think, as a matter of principle, there should be a procedure for investigating complaints of sexual harassment against former ministers in the Scottish Government?
Yes. Unequivocally, absolutely. Because otherwise, you don't have that ability. Politics, perhaps more than any other walk of life, people in positions of political power are powerful people, and therefore it presumably is difficult, more difficult, not impossible, for people to bring forward complaints. So if that ability to hold somebody, somebody like me, to account stops the moment you cease to be in that position of authority, then clearly that is closing off the ability for you to be held to account should complaints come forward in the future. So I think very clearly, and I think that is the way this is going with including this organisation, and that's what I suppose I just fundamentally found difficult to grasp about Alex's evidence on Friday, that he seemed to be saying, albeit qualified it a little bit, that the complaints against him shouldn't have been investigated and shouldn't have been capable of being investigated because there should have been no retrospective policy in place. And I fundamentally disagree with that.
So yes, there's a fundamental disagreement between you, because he said, I do not think you can make that argument. Legally, I've been informed that you could perhaps try that argument pre-2010 when there's no such policy, but it would be very difficult to make that argument to make it legal or lawful. So there's a fundamental disagreement between you on that point.
On that point and perhaps others.
In terms of the relationship that the Deputy First Minister had and the First Minister had in Fairness at Work, and the new procedure, as Deputy First Minister under the Fairness at Work, you would have been passed a copy of a complaint if informal resolution had failed in relation to any complaints against current ministers. That never happened, of course. But under the new procedure, it's you, the same person, but now as First Minister, who has that responsibility. Why did Mr. Salmond as First Minister not have the role that you now have as First Minister? Or to put it another way, why did you as Deputy First Minister have that role, whereas the current Deputy First Minister does not? Mr. Salmond tried to explain that in terms of conflicts with the Ministerial Code. Do you have a view?
I'm not sure I do, or not one that I feel I can articulate to you now. I don't recall why particularly it was the case that the Deputy First Minister was in that role under Fairness at Work. And again, and I can appreciate that people will think, how can that possibly be the case? In all my years as Deputy First Minister, I wasn't really consciously aware very often, if at all, about Fairness at Work or the fact you know, obviously I knew I had that role, but it wasn't something that crossed my desk. The discussions around the development of the procedure were very much, in this respect, about, you know, trying to, I suppose, avoid. And remember, this was in the wake of Me Too. And you read out something else from my evidence about the perception that organisations, people closed ranks against these kind of views. This was a procedure that was covering current and former ministers, i.e. politicians, and therefore my view was that the First Minister, as a politician, potentially of the same party, should not be in the role of either deciding to investigate a complaint or doing the investigation. So that was the thinking behind the development of the procedure. I'm not sure, without going back into the dark mists of time and seeing if there's an explanation there, I could sit here right now and give you a full explanation of why the Fairness at Work policy developed exactly as it did.
Okay. Were you ever advised during the development of the procedure that the retrospective element, whereby it applied to former ministers, was of doubtful legality?
I do not recall being advised of that, which no, I don't believe I was. I don't recall being advised of any concerns about the fundamental legality. I would have assumed, and now know, obviously you've heard evidence from people that legal advice was taken on an ongoing basis as the procedure was developed.
Paragraph 13 of the procedure, where the former minister was a member of an administration formed by a different political party, where that's the case, the permanent secretary is given the role of informing the party leader of the outcome of the investigation and any action taken. The end of this process seems to be a little bit strange, because what is the leader of that political party to do with his information? What if the former minister, for example, is no longer a member of that political party? One of the criticisms of the procedure seems to be it ends in this rather strange circumstance where you're passing very sensitive information over to a leader of another political party who may not even be the leader of that political party when the minister being complained of was a member, and the minister may not be a member as well. Have you got any concerns about that kind of end point of this procedure?
The thought processes at the time were about the need, if a complaint in the context of an HR process was upheld against somebody who had been a former minister, then the party of which they had been part should have an awareness of that, you know, in case they held positions of authority within the party. It would have been for the party to decide what to do with that. So that was the thought process there. Like all, given what we've been through in the last couple of years, I think all of these things are legitimate areas to probe and to question.
And finally, for now, Convener, given that the new procedure was to be made applicable to former ministers, of whom must be dozens, I don't know, 40, 50, since 1999, what efforts were made to inform them of the fact that they might be made the subject of complaints under the procedure?
We didn't, and I think it was you that pursued this line of questioning on Friday, that there had been a suggestion that we would inform, I think, former First Ministers. I think a letter was drafted and the decision was taken, and I don't have a very, you know, I don't have a crystal clear recollection of this. I think at the time we decided, I would have been part of that. I think I decided that given that this was an HR policy, that it wasn't necessary and wouldn't necessarily have been appropriate to go to external consultation beyond the kind of trade union consultation that we had. So that was that led to the fact that we didn't do what you have suggested.
Okay, and I think that draft letter has not been disclosed to the committee. The government, please supply.
Requested yesterday. I am happy. I see no reason why it wouldn't be or shouldn't be. So I'm happy to undertake that will be done.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Yes, the committee will discuss that in its private session afterwards. We move now to Alasdair Allan.
Thank you, Convener. First Minister, you've mentioned that the process wasn't declared unlawful, but can you explain for people who perhaps don't understand the distinction between the process being declared unlawful and the application of the process being declared unlawful, what that means?
So the procedure is still in place. So if a complaint about a current or a former minister came in again, that procedure is still extant and could be used. There were a number, I think the initial judicial review petition had 8 grounds of challenge, some of them about the application of it, but some of them about the fundamental lawfulness of the procedure itself. So it was ultra vires, it shouldn't have been retrospective, and none of those were tested in court because of what happened with the judicial review. So none of those concerns have been established one way or the other. So the procedure itself has not been declared to be unlawful and could be used, although, as I said, we've got Laura Dunlop doing some independent internal work for the government on aspects of that. What went wrong here was that when there were complaints to be investigated and the procedure effectively was activated, in the appointment of the investigating officer, which is a part of the procedure, a mistake was made because, as it turns out, and I'm summarising here, the investigating officer had had prior contact with those who were making complaints. So it was in how the procedure was used that the flaw was identified, not in the fundamentals of the procedure. And I know that is difficult for people to grasp, but I hope I've explained it reasonably clearly.
Thank you. Last week, Mr Salmond seemed to wholly reject the idea that complaints against former ministers were legally possible. When he was asked about whether in principle he supported it, he said, I don't think that you can make that argument. It would be very difficult to make that argument and to make it legal or lawful. So even although the Court of Session didn't rule the procedure itself unlawful, was the inclusion of former ministers, in your view, unlawful or created difficulties?
No. I think one of the civil servants you heard from, James Hine, made this point. You know, by definition, the government created this procedure, it was signed off, legal advice was taken along the way, so the government considers that the procedure is lawful. Mr Salmond challenged aspects of that. As I said earlier on, one of the reasons why there would have been a public interest in the judicial review going to a full judicial conclusion where a judge could have decided is that we would have got a definitive answer on that. So, we don't know what the outcome would be, but the government's position is that that aspect of the procedure is lawful, and nobody has established to the contrary.
Mr Salmond also questioned the idea that complaints or a complaints process against former ministers would even be necessary. He said that, I think it would be difficult to understand why, coming out of the Me Too movement and the range of huge issues that were discussed in Parliament on the 31st of October, anyone would think or believe that it was absolutely required in the Scottish Parliament that there was a policy on former ministers. Is he not making a fair point about that?
And from his perspective, I'm sure he is. From my perspective, so in Parliament that day, which, if my memory is right on this, I think it is, the John Swinney answered the question on the afternoon of the Cabinet meeting. He was saying that we had decided to review our policies. It wasn't a debate, I don't think it was a debate at all, but it wasn't a discussion of a new policy. And this is a kind of personal reflection on public debate at that time, I think it would have been very hard to draw a conclusion at that time that historic complaints and the relative difficulty in investigating historic complaints wasn't a pretty central part of the Me Too concerns, because it was. And therefore, to come to a conclusion that nobody would have thought that that was a legitimate or a priority issue, I really struggle with as somebody who paid a lot of attention to that debate at the time.
When asked about what's since become known as the Edinburgh Airport incident, Mr Salmond said that because of the atmosphere at the time, November 2017, perhaps people were overreacting in a number of ways. Did you feel that people were overreacting to the Me Too movement in November 2017?
I don't think people were overreacting. I don't think the Scottish Government overreacted. I don't think Parliament overreacted in the steps it took. I think 3 3.5 years, or not quite that, over 3 years on, I suspect a more legitimate criticism is that the world has ultimately underreacted to some of the concerns that were raised there, because I think, unfortunately, I'm not sure that women would necessarily say it's got an awful lot better. So I don't think there was an overreaction. And I certainly don't think there was an overreaction on the part of the government.
Any sexual harassment procedure against current or former ministers may, of course, result in complaints being levelled at powerful people who have both the means and the inclination to challenge those complaints in court. Shouldn't the Scottish Government really have been readier for a judicial review challenge to the procedure? For instance, it appears from the evidence that civil servants treated the procedure like any other employment policy, with legal checks being provided by employment lawyers. So if you'd have thought that the handling of complaints under the procedure might end up in court, shouldn't the government have had public lawyers scrutinising whether complaints handled under the procedure would be robust if they were challenged in judicial review?
So with hindsight, Dr. Allan, I think that is a legitimate comment and reflection. You know, none of us, certainly I, wouldn't have wanted to be sitting here at the culmination of everything that has happened over the past couple of years. So yes, we have to think with hindsight of all of these things and consider whether we should have done things differently. Unfortunately, you don't have that hindsight when you're doing these things, and we couldn't have anticipated. Maybe we should have done, but we didn't at that point anticipate what has unfolded since. It was an employment procedure, albeit with particular features that make it appear to be much more in the political sphere. I absolutely accept that, but it was an employment procedure, and the government took legal advice and had legal input as it developed that procedure. And I think, obviously, again, having looked back at all of this, I wasn't aware of all the correspondence at the time, but you know, I think the government was ready for a judicial review, and until something came to light that hadn't been known and appreciated earlier, the government was confident in its ability to defend the procedure, and the legal advice that was published yesterday, I think, demonstrates that. The note of prospects, which I think was late September, you know, like any piece of legal advice, will, you know, on the one hand and on the other hand, and will rank risks of successful challenge. That's in the nature of legal advice, but across all of the grounds of challenge, the government was confident as you can ever be in a legal action, that it could succeed. And we know now that that changed, and I won't go on just now because I know we'll come on to that in more detail later.
Some have claimed to us that this procedure was created to get Alex Salmond. I don't offer an opinion on that, but I suspect you may.
It wasn't, absolutely, emphatically not. And I just say to people, and you know, again, this is stuff we might get into later on, Alex Salmond has been, and I've said this many times, one of the closest people to me in my entire life, and some people around this table know what I mean by that more than others might. I would never have wanted to get Alex Salmond, and I would never, ever have wanted any of this to happen. If I could have, short of brushing complaints under the carpet, which would have been wrong to be, if I could turn the clock back and find legitimate ways that none of this would ever have happened, then I would. Alex Salmond has been, for most of my life, since I was about 20, 21 years old, not just a very close political colleague, a friend, in my younger days, somebody I looked up to and revered. You know, I had no motive, intention, desire to get Alex Salmond.
Turning to the development of the procedure itself, can you set out what role you personally played? You've given some indication of this, but what role personally you played in the creation of the procedure? And I mean, prior to signing it off.
Not a day-to-day central one by any stretch of the imagination. And again, you know, I know people who, which is most people, understandably, and would have been me before I was in government, you know, not been as familiar as I am with the day-to-day workings of government would think, how could that possibly be the case? But, you know, for any minister, particularly a First Minister, you're dealing with, you know, a multitude of things every day, ranked in order of priority and importance, and that shifts and changes. Something like this is kind of done almost at arm's length. You've got civil servants doing it. You will be kept up to date periodically when appropriate. At key moments in something like this, you'll be consulted if there is a particular policy issue that requires to be discussed or that requires clear ministerial authority. And I think I said earlier on, I would, in the development of this policy, I suppose, identify 3 particular issues that fall into that category. And I was, you know, consulted and had a part in the procedure at these stages. The most significant intervention was giving the express written authority for a procedure that included former ministers and current ministers. Actually, that at the time was more about the inclusion of current ministers because of the interaction with the Ministerial Code. And it was current ministers that were added in to the policy at a later stage. As you've heard from others, former ministers were actually included from the very initial draft.
There's been some discussion about the role that the First Minister should have in the complaints handling process. Mr Salmond told this committee that he was surprised that the First Minister did not have a role in that part of the procedure. Now, you've touched on this, but can you explain why, in your view, a First Minister doesn't have the same role in the procedure as they did in the original policy, Fairness at Work?
Well, I mean, we've gone through the Fairness at Work. You know, it's the Deputy First Minister that is more centrally involved when a complaint is lodged than the First Minister. Look, my view, and this is, you know, I can not just offer an abstract view, I can tell you, I thought it was important. And again, this is in the context of, how best to describe this, the world kind of having changed in the realms of all of this because of Me Too. So the old ways of doing things were what were in the spotlight and being, in some respects, considered to be inadequate and wrong, that they led to too much reliance on informal resolution. You know, they gave powerful folk too much opportunity to evade accountability, or, you know, people closed ranks. So and this was Me Too driven, I thought in a procedure that was there, that had it been used at all, would have been used for current or former politicians. It was best for a First Minister, a current politician, to be as far removed from that as possible, so that there was no suggestion, you know, ironic given where we are, there was no suggestion that a First Minister of the same party as somebody be complained about could be trying to influence how the investigation was taking place for political reasons, to protect their, you know, colleague or to protect their party from reputational damage. Me Too seemed to make it more important that we didn't have those perceptions and those risks. And that was the backdrop to some of these key decisions that were taken in the development of the procedure. Finally,
Convener, you mentioned the culture change, although I don't think you used those words, but the culture change that was taking place around Me Too. The Permanent Secretary has told us in the past that that culture change was being reflected in the UK civil service as well. Was it something that you sensed was being acted upon, or people had an enthusiasm for across the civil service in Scotland? Did people have to be told this was a good thing to do?
The civil service, and again, you've got to experience this, the civil service will, you know, if the Cabinet decides something is a priority, it's their job to get on and do that. So it's not that they were, you know, to describe the civil service as personally enthusiastic would be, I think, to misdescribe their role. They were acting on the instructions and the requests that the elected Cabinet had given them. But I think everybody at that time was, I mean, I don't know about all of you, I remember the Me Too stuff being really quite shocking, not in the sense that, God, you hadn't known that this kind of stuff happened, but the fact that it was coming out into the open, that people were prepared to confront these things, was a big moment. I remember, as I'm sure others did, doing interviews at the time, talking about a kind of watershed moment. So there was a sense that we had to live up to that. We had to be prepared to meet the moment. Now, you know, 3 years on, some people think that was all an overreaction. I don't. I think it was right to try to do that. I regret the fact that because certain things weren't done the way they should have been done, we're sitting here, and what I deeply regret is that then allows aspersions to be cast on the motives of what we were doing at the time, which I think were absolutely right and proper.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Questions in this section, Convener.
Ah, right. Jackie Baillie.
No questions in this section either.
Alex Hamilton.
I've no questions in this section. It's complaints handling we're after.
All right. Well, that's very refreshing. I have... Stuart McMillan does have questions in this session. So could I ask Mr McMillan then to lead us on to the complaints handling session as well and take all your questions?
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, First Minister. First Minister, prior to contacting the Permanent Secretary at the point when you thought that legal action was actually against the Scottish Government was actually going to take place, did you have any involvement in the formal complaint handling process?
No.
Okay, after the contact with the Permanent Secretary, did you have any involvement in the formal complaints handling process?
I wasn't involved in the handling of the complaint or the investigation of the complaint.
Okay. Certainly, another aspect of this is much of the focus of the committee has become about the questions of meetings and recollections and conclusions of which certainly are not going to help what's happened in the past, the present, or future complainers of sexual harassment. But what certainly will help is the correcting of the errors in the complaints handling process, and something you've also touched upon earlier. And our evidence has highlighted that clear mistakes were made in the division of the responsibilities between those tasked with that role of communicating with complainants and also those tasked with the role of investigating complaints. Do you accept that this went wrong, and certainly what can be done to avoid it actually going wrong in the future?
I unreservedly accept that things went wrong in that respect, and have given an apology today for that. We are reviewing, I know this has been referred by me many times already today, and others have referred to it previously, but Laura Dunlop QC is reviewing these aspects and these matters for the government. Right now I'm not sure exactly when we are going to get her report. I think the Deputy First Minister has been corresponding or will correspond with the committee on that. So that will be an opportunity, in addition to whatever this committee wants to reflect on or suggest. That will be an opportunity for us to consider why these things happened institutionally and what needs to be done to ensure that should a situation like this occur again, it wouldn't happen in the future.
Some of the evidence that we've heard as a committee has indicated the possibility of a deciding officer or an investigating officer being independent of government. Is that something that the Scottish Government would consider?
We'll consider any recommendations that the committee puts forward. It's not one I've particularly given any consideration to date, but if it is a recommendation that we get, of course we'll consider it.
Okay. I want to touch upon a question from earlier on. We've heard that a concern about Mr Salmond himself was handled by him, giving an informal apology, something that's been touched upon earlier, and that only years later did the person concerned feel able to make a formal complaint. Now, this clearly makes it look like the formal procedures under the FAW process were not good enough. Do you accept that?
In relation to the specific, I'm not sure I can draw any particular conclusion because I wasn't involved in that at the time. I didn't know about it at the time an apology was made. So I have no direct knowledge of exactly what went on then, what happened in terms of the apology or what the basis of the person involved was for accepting that as a resolution at the time. to be frank, only know about that what I have since been told by Alex Salmond or heard more generally in the wider proceedings that have been underway. So I couldn't say that I couldn't say categorically that that particular incident meant that there was a flaw or a failing in fairness at work. I think generally, as I've already commented on, I think there is something to reflect on there, particularly about sexual harassment and the appropriateness of informal resolution over more formal action being taken.
Could I remind all members, please, to be general rather than specific in talking about individual complaints, etc.
Sorry, Convener. The Permanent Secretary certainly told this committee that her direct line manager, the head of the UK Civil Service, wanted all permanent secretaries to ensure that the procedures could tackle the challenges of Me Too. And the official report shows us that MSPs of all parties spoke in favour of more being done to actually tackle the issue. Did you feel that you have got a broad base of support for the idea of putting in place a new procedure to tackle sexual harassment?
I certainly wouldn't speak for other governments in terms of what we actually did. It is factual to say that the Cabinet Secretary at the time, Sir Jeremy Haywood, wrote to the Permanent Secretary, I think later the week, that Cabinet gave the Commission to review processes. And that reflects a point I've made already. This was something all organisations were doing, reviewing its processes. At the time, I can't remember the exact date, I had a discussion with Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at the time, about this matter, because she was concerned about it and was, taking steps to review Conservative Party processes, and obviously the UK government was looking at these matters as well. But I wouldn't go from that to say the UK government somehow endorsed what we did. You've heard, which I wasn't aware of at the time, but I'm aware of now, and actually don't think is particularly significant, that the Cabinet Office had commented, not particularly about former ministers, but some comment that it felt uncomfortable to have a policy relating to current or former ministers. So I wouldn't claim their endorsement one way or another for what we did. I think what we did was done for the right reasons. I think we have a procedure that has not been declared unlawful, and I'm not going to labour that point because it hasn't been tested in court. But a mistake was made in its application, and nobody can get away from that. In terms of endorsement, and again, I know you've heard from trade unions, I think, and I don't want to speak for them, and I certainly don't want to misquote their evidence, I think there was a general agreement that looking at procedures, putting a procedure of this nature in place, applying it to former ministers was not an unreasonable thing to be doing.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to move on to Ministerial Code now. Convener. In your...
Mr McMillan, can I stop you? Did you say Ministerial Code?
Yes.
I would prefer to leave that till after the break.
Okay.
If you've got anything further on the implementation of the policy.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jackie Baillie.
Thank you very much, and good morning, First Minister. Can I just note, though, that the procedure that you discussed with some of my colleagues hasn't actually been used since it was last used with Alex Salmond, and it's essentially been lying on the shelf gathering dust. So we have concerns that the procedure itself isn't robust enough, given that it's not been used. Can I explore with you the confidentiality of complainants, something that I think you and I will both care about? And can I start with the issue that I raised with you, along with Willie Rennie, at FMQs last week? There was a series of meetings prior to the meeting on the 29th of March between yourself, Jeff Aberdeen, Alex Salmond's former Chief of Staff, and a senior member of your team. At one of those early meetings, the complaints against Alex Salmond were revealed to Jeff Aberdeen. Could I ask you, who authorised the senior member of your team to have that meeting? Was it you? Was it the Permanent Secretary? Or were they simply freelancing?
First, before I go on to that, can I just say for the record, I was not claiming that the procedure had been used for complaints other than Alex Salmond. But that doesn't change the fact that the procedure is still extant and hasn't been declared unlawful. Convener, I want to answer this question as fully as I can, but like the rest of the committee, I am under legal constraints as to what I can say. In terms of meetings, I think I would not accept Jackie Baillie's characterisation of it. I certainly, was not at the meeting that has been described. Neither, should I say, were people who are seeking to attest to the content of that meeting. What I would say is that, as I understand it, James Hamilton, who is conducting the independent investigation under the Ministerial Code, has evidence from the people who were at that meeting. I wasn't, therefore I cannot give a direct account. What I can say is that the account I have been given has assured me, or given me assurances, that what is alleged to have happened at it didn't happen in the way that has been described. But as I say, as I understand it, James Hamilton has the accounts of those who were at the meeting. I understand the person who's been described as a senior government official is willing and has offered to give private evidence to the committee on this matter, and that's for the committee to decide whether they want to take it up. So to describe this as a meeting that was authorised and that it happened in the way Jackie Baillie is suggesting is not something I would accept. Obviously, the constraints that I am under, unfortunately, mean that it's not possible for me to go much further than that. What I would do, though, and what I can speak to is, and I don't want to stray into territory we'll come on to later, but the discussion I had with Alex Salmond on the 2nd of April, in terms of the identity of complainants, I heard him, he seemed very certain on Friday that a complainant had been named by somebody in government at a meeting he wasn't at, but seemed less sure about whether a complainant had been named at a meeting he was at. Alex Salmond was open with me about the identity of one complainant because he knew, he hadn't been told about it, and there was no suggestion that I can recall that anybody in the government had told him. He knew about the identity of one complainant because he knew about the incident, because he had apologised to the person concerned. The other complainant, and what I can't recall is if the name of the other complainant was shared openly on the 2nd of April in the way that the one I've just spoken about was, but he also knew the identity of that complainant. And I remember him talking about how he had gone through the Scottish Government Flickr account to find out who had been with them on particular days. So the point I'm making is that on the 2nd of April, I don't recall any suggestion from Alex Salmond that he had been told about the name of a complainant via or in the way that is being suggested. What I do know is that he knew the identity of both complainants in one respect because he knew about the incident, and in the other respect through his own investigations.
Thank you, First Minister. I'll come on to exploring that in a minute, but can I take you back to my question, which was the point at which complaints against Alex Salmond were revealed to Jeff Aberdeen. Did you know the meeting was taking place?
Not to the best of my recollection. Let me be clear. Somebody in my team meeting Jeff Aberdeen back then would not have been something that was particularly newsworthy. Jeff Aberdeen's a friend of most of us and a former colleague.
I would agree with you. It wouldn't be newsworthy. But
I know, I don't recall that being the case. Can I just also say for the record, Convener, that based on, and remember I wasn't a party to this discussion, but based on what I have been told about it, I don't accept Jackie Baillie's characterisation of it.
Okay, you might not accept my characterisation of it, but Jeff Aberdeen's conversation with Kevin Pringle and Duncan Hamilton QC is confirmed in written evidence to this committee. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that they're not telling the truth? Or are you saying that Jeff Aberdeen isn't telling the truth?
I'm not casting aspersions on the veracity of anybody else. That's not what I'm here to do. What I would say is that Kevin and Duncan also weren't at this discussion. So, this is...
But they are corroborating something that Jeff Aberdeen said. So is Jeff Aberdeen's recollection incorrect?
I don't know, because I don't know what Jeff Aberdeen... I don't know directly what Jeff Aberdeen is saying about this. What I do know is that James Hamilton has the accounts of the people who were at that meeting, and therefore will be able to properly consider this. This committee, it's not for me to tell this committee how to do its work, obviously, but I listened to the Lord Advocate yesterday say that while there are certain things this committee cannot publish, it is not prevented from considering. And I say again, I understand that there has been, I actually understand there has been evidence given to this committee that denies that allegation, and I think there's been an offer of private evidence as well.
Can I move you on to the name of a complainer being revealed to Mr Aberdeen, and then him communicating that subsequently to Mr Salmond? I'm sure you will agree that that is an extraordinary breach of confidentiality, and in any other employment would be a sackable offence. So can I ask, who authorised the senior member of your team to reveal that name of one of the complainants to Jeff Aberdeen? Was it you? Was it the Permanent Secretary? Or were they freelancing?
I am not accepting that happened, so therefore I am clearly not accepting that was authorised in the way that Jackie Baillie. I accept that this is a matter of contention, and unfortunately there are legal constraints in terms of what we can discuss publicly at this committee, but that is not a constraint that in his consideration James Hamilton is under. So I'm not going to sit here and just accept the premise of questions that are being put to me where I dispute the premise of the question. And the next thing I would say, which I don't know for certain, but based on what I said about Alex Salmond's knowledge of the identity of complainants and the basis for that knowledge when he spoke to me on the 2nd of April, I did note in Duncan Hamilton's written submission yesterday that he said something along the lines of this was communicated in the days after Alex Salmond had his letter from the government. Certainly, in relation to one of the complainants, Alex Salmond was pretty clear he had found out through investigations of Scottish Government social media accounts who that was. And in relation to the other one, which must have been the case, and this is the bit I'm perhaps just speculating on, must have been the case when he got that letter, because he knew about the incident, because he had apologised to the person. So my assumption would be that he would have known that without anybody having to tell him in terms of that complainant. And I know from what he told me that he found out the identity of the other one through his own investigations.
Can I ask you, First Minister, because you've worked with Kevin Pringle, you would count him as a friend. He's saying that he heard this information. You've worked with Duncan Hamilton. He is a QC. He is attesting to the same information about a complainer's name being revealed by a senior member of your team. Leaving aside that they weren't in the room, you trust what they say to you and have done in the past. But Jeff Aberdeen, who was in the room, who you describe as a friend, are you saying that he is lying about this?
I'm not here to make that accusation of anybody. What I am saying is that Kevin and Duncan weren't part of that discussion. I wasn't part of that discussion. And the two people who were part of that discussion, I have heard accounts of Jeff's version. I have not heard that directly from Jeff. And in terms of the other party to that discussion, they have a different account of that. The committee, it's up to the committee to decide whether in private it can hear directly from these people. And James Hamilton, of course, has the accounts of these people. So there is a clear difference here. The point I am making is that because of the reasons I have set out in relation to one complainant, where Alex Salmond knew about the incident because he had apologised to her, the knowledge of the identity of that complainant may well have been known, and my assumption is that it would have been known to Alex Salmond at that time for these reasons. But the particular version of this that I wasn't party to is not one that I know is accepted by the person that was in that discussion.
In response to me and to Willie Rennie at First Minister's questions, you said you had no knowledge of this at all. At what point did you speak to your senior official about this?
When there was a suggestion made about this, I can't remember the exact date, but I can check that for you if you want. I can't remember the date.
So it predated First Minister's questions?
I think you can take it as read that when I said that to the best of my knowledge, let me reiterate, I wasn't at this discussion, so
but you've
I'm not capable.
You've spoken to the
but
senior official.
I do not believe, based on what I have been told, that account is accurate. But that is based on not actually being party to that discussion. And as I say, there are others who will, and this committee could, I'm sure, speak privately, even if it can't do so publicly, to the individuals concerned.
So just so I'm clear, you spoke to the senior official before First Minister's questions last week, and therefore the answer you gave to both myself and to Willie Rennie wasn't necessarily strictly accurate.
Sorry, I don't follow.
Okay, it's really simple. We asked you about your knowledge about this, and you said that there was absolutely nothing happened with revealing the name of a complainer and that it was out with your knowledge.
No,
that's clearly not the case if you've spoken to an official in advance of our questioning last week.
I think I'd have to go back and check the official record. To the best of my knowledge, what was being alleged didn't happen, is what I was seeking to convey.
I'm sure we'll all check the official record. Can I ask, in your discussion with the senior official, did you investigate this? Was there any disciplinary process that was gone through to arrive at a conclusion that this wasn't said?
The clear view of the person who is being accused of this is that this didn't happen, and you know, I am not able to go into, for the legal constraints that I am under, the reasons why that is the case, and the reasons and what may actually be the situation here. But others can do that, and you know, James Hamilton is one of them. And I say again, I don't know of any reason why the committee cannot, at least privately, speak to the individuals concerned.
Are you not worried that a senior member of your staff was freelancing in this way?
I don't accept that characterisation.
Okay. Can I move on, Convener, to the leak to the Daily Record, because this again concerns the confidentiality of complainants. When did you become aware of the leak to the Daily Record?
I became aware there had been a query to the Scottish Government from the Daily Record on sometime, I think, in the afternoon of, from memory, quite late afternoon of the 23rd of August, which is the day before the story ran in the Daily Record. That's when I became aware of it. That's when I became aware of it.
I think just my understanding was there were actually two stories. I think one on the 23rd and the other perhaps on the 25th, which actually had details of complainants. The first, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, talked about complaints against Alex Salmond, but the second leak went into details of those complaints. Where do you consider the leaks came from? Mr. Salmond believes it was somebody within your team. The ICO identified a small group of people, 23 people, that would be broadly consistent with Mr. Salmond's view. So I'm curious to know where you think the leaks came from.
I don't know where the leaks came from. I can tell you where I know they didn't come from. They didn't come from me. They didn't come from anybody acting on my authority or on my instruction or at my request. I am as certain as I can be that they didn't come from anybody within my office. As you said, the second story had some considerable detail. I heard Alex Salmond say that is detail that could only have come from the decision report. I was never sent a copy of the decision report. The one other thing I would say about this is, I've said all along, and I will keep saying, I was of the view that I should not act in a way that tried to sweep these complaints under the carpet. And therefore, I would not have acted in a way that blocked any sort of public comment about the outcome of this, had it been the case that that was what the government thought was appropriate to do. That is not the same thing as saying that I wanted this to be in the public domain. Since I first became aware of what Alex Salmond was facing, the thought of it becoming public, the thought of having to comment on it, horrified me. Absolutely horrified me, made me feel physically sick. I would have been perfectly relieved, very relieved if it was legitimate and it wasn't because I was trying to sweep it under the carpet, if it had never come out into the public domain. There was no part of me wanted proactively to see that get into the public domain. I had nothing to gain from it and only a lot of pain and grief associated with it.
Okay. My understanding is your office was sent a copy of the decision report. And so the leak contained confidential information about the two women involved. And I think we would both agree that that is a matter of very serious concern and regret. I have, however, been told that the Daily Record were given the story of the complaints about Alex Salmond in order to spike another story that they had about you. Is that remotely true?
That is not even something I had heard before. Can I just say, your understanding that you started that question with, as I think you know, is inaccurate, that my office wasn't sent a copy of the decision report. My principal private secretary, when he appeared before the committee, wrote afterwards just to confirm that, because I think there had been some confusion between the letter that the permanent secretary wrote me on the 22nd of August to tell me that the investigation had concluded and what was happening there. But my office was not and has not since been shared a copy of the decision report. So just to be clear about that, and I think the committee has been made very clear about that too. So now you can tell me what the story was about me that I was
don't know.
Trying to spike.
I was asking. I was
I'm
asking you, and I wouldn't reveal that publicly without checking with you.
Just think how implausible that. I've never heard that before, so that's a new part of the conspiracy that I'm hearing today for the first time. But imagine how implausible that is. So we have an investigation that starts with 2 complaints against Alex Salmond that the government is investigating, throughout much of that year, and we just managed to time the culmination to spike some unknown story about me. That's an incredible coincidence, which is why it didn't happen.
Indeed, it is an incredible coincidence, but it gives you an opportunity to rebut that, which is very helpful. But can I take you back to the seriousness of the leak? Wherever it came from, it was clearly really concerning. Why didn't you or anybody on your behalf report the matter to the police?
Well, firstly, I agree about how concerning the leak is. It's one of many aspects of this that deeply troubles me because I don't know where it came from. And, as you put aside the serious nature of the issue we're dealing with, it always troubles a politician when they don't know where a leak comes from. But I don't. What I do know is that I would not have wanted, if you'd given me the chance of this whole sorry matter never been in the public domain legitimately, I would have bitten your hand off for that. I never wanted to be publicly commenting on allegations of this nature against Alex Salmond. There is no part of me wanted to be in that position. It's also the case that the government didn't benefit in any way from this leak. Now, okay, I appreciate that's with hindsight, but it was this leak that has allowed some people from day one almost to cast the government as the aggressor, the guilty party on this. So I don't know where the leak came from. I emphatically know it did not come from me or anybody acting on my authority or instruction. In terms of there obviously was investigations within the Scottish Government and Mr Salmond raised the matter, reported the matter to the Information Commissioner's office. There was an investigation and then I think a review of that investigation by the Information Commissioner's office, including by, and forgive me if I'm not getting the terminology right, its criminal investigation section, and they did not find evidence that it had come from within the Scottish Government.
My recollection is that they did, and it was a limited number of people that it could have come from. But I'm not going to argue the point with you. My question was, why wasn't it reported to the police?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm happy to go away and reflect and think. I don't know whether that was something we considered. It wasn't, as far as I'm aware, reported to the police by the Scottish Government. Can I just, in terms of the ICO investigation decision letter, which is dated the 6th of March 2020, we are satisfied that there is no evidence to corroborate the complaint that an employee of the Scottish Government unlawfully obtained and disclosed personal data relating to Mr Salmond. We're also satisfied that there is no evidence that the Scottish Government acted in breach of Article 5.1 of the regulation in relation to the processing of Mr Salmond's personal data. Mr Salmond has pointed to, and I probably won't be able to find this now, a comment, I think, when the decision was being reviewed at his request, where somebody said they were sympathetic to the hypothesis that it could have come from within the Scottish Government, but they had no evidence of that. And in fact, they expressly said that there was also, it could also be said that there was a possibility that it came from other sources as well. So to say that the Information Commissioner said that it came from the Scottish Government, I would put to you, Ms Baillie, is not true.
Can I then ask you again, First Minister, who else knew about this? Who else had details of the complaints that would have leaked that to the press?
So in terms of the numbers of people or the identities of people within the Scottish Government who would have had access to the decision report, I would have to sort of check and give that to you. I did not have access to the decision report. My office didn't have access to the decision report. I think you've heard evidence that the matter was referred through the Crown Agent to the police, but as I understand it, the police didn't take a copy of the decision report. Mr Salmond and his lawyers obviously had a copy of the decision report. I say that simply as a statement of fact. I do not know where the leak came from, and I cannot say that emphatically enough. I wish I did know where the leak came from. Like everybody else, I can hypothesise and speculate. I do not know. What I do know emphatically is that it did not come from me or anybody acting on my authority or instruction.
Will you ask the police to investigate now?
I'm happy to consider that, but I think...
Well, given your concerns, which I share,
well,
surely we should do that.
It's not... Me saying I want to consider that is not an indication that I don't think it is serious. And I think you heard a little bit of this from the Crown Agent yesterday. The way these things are reported for criminal investigation here would be through, and I will stand corrected if I'm getting any of this wrong because I'm not an expert on the legal basis, but the ICO review, as part of its criminal review team, looked at this, and had they thought there was evidence, they would then have referred it through the police or the Crown Office. The fact that they have already done that and decided there wasn't evidence of that would simply lead me to believe there may not be much purpose in doing what you're asking me to do, because that process has already been undertaken. But given that you have asked me, I'm not going to sit here and answer it definitively right now, but given that you have asked me, I will consider it and come back to you when I've had the chance to do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. We're at the time we should take a break, but I know that Murdo Fraser has a very specific supplementary to Jackie Baillie's session. So quickly, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, First Minister. Can I just follow up briefly, if I may, the line of questioning from Jackie Baillie about the release, or the alleged release of the name of a complainant to Jeff Aberdeen, which is an incredibly serious issue, you would accept, and would be an appalling breach of privacy. We've heard what Jeff Aberdeen had to say. Let me just read you what Duncan Hamilton said in his submission. I can also confirm that I was told the name of a complainant by Mr Aberdeen in the early part of March 2018. I cannot recall the precise date, but it was very shortly after the 7th of March, the date Mr Salmond received this letter. The name of the complainant had been given to Mr Aberdeen by a senior government official. I confirm I am aware of the identity of the government official who gave the name of the complainant to Mr Aberdeen. The fact that the government official had shared that information with Mr Aberdeen was reported to me and to Kevin Pringle on a conference call. I had never heard of the individual named, but Mr Pringle had. And in his written submission, Mr Kevin Pringle basically corroborates that. So here we have a statement by Jeff Aberdeen, corroborated by Duncan Hamilton, and corroborated by Kevin Pringle. You're a lawyer, you're well aware in the rules of evidence of the importance of corroboration. You've suggested that the senior official we're talking about has a different version of events. Who would corroborate that alternative version of events?
you would have to, and you know, it's not for me to tell the committee how to do its work, but it is, you started your question to me there with the statement, I think, that we have heard from Jeff Aberdeen. I'm not aware that the committee has heard from Jeff Aberdeen. If I'm wrong about that, I apologise. And has certainly not, as I understand it, certainly not orally heard from the other person. It is open to the committee to test that privately with either or both of them. James Hamilton, I understand, has accounts for, from both of them and will be able to make his assessment of that. My understanding, and I was not a party to this discussion, is that that did not happen. Now, in a discussion where there are two people, then clearly if you've got a different account, then people have to decide, taking account of the whole picture, which we're not able to do today, unfortunately, because of the constraints upon us. But what I would say is, as I said already, Duncan and Kevin were not party to that discussion. The bit of the evidence, and you know, I am making assumptions here, and I want to be very clear about that. But the bit of the evidence from Duncan that you read out about how this is information after Mr. Salmond had received a letter, I think on the 7th of March. My assumption, based on what I know about this, and based on what Mr. Salmond shared with me, is that by that point, I can't work out how Mr. Salmond would not have known that from his own knowledge at that point. I think. And again, I will stand to be corrected. I think Jeff knew at the time about the apology to this individual in 2013. So the fact that there was a knowledge of the identity of this individual may well have been the case. But you know, I can only say what I have been advised about this conversation. I wasn't party to it. It would be serious if the identity of a complainant was revealed. I absolutely accept that. But that is not what I understand happened in the way that is being set out. And as I say, it is open to the committee to take evidence, even if it is in private, from both of the people who were party to that. I come back to another point, and again, if my recollection is wrong about this, then no doubt somebody will say so. But I do not recall Alex Salmond giving me any suggestion on the 2nd of April that he had known the identity of a complainer, because it had been told to him by somebody in the Scottish Government. I repeat again, one of the complainers he knew about because he knew about the incident. You know, if you are openly saying you've apologised to somebody for an alleged incident, then clearly you know who they are. And I do remember him telling, I don't remember if he used the name in the second complainer, but he had identified the second complainer by going through the Scottish Government Flickr account. So I'm trying here to tell you what I know from my own recollection and my own direct discussions. I've gone as far as I can in telling you my understanding of a discussion that I wasn't party to.
Thank you, First Minister, but it doesn't get away from the fact that we have a statement here that two other individuals will corroborate. I've given you the opportunity to say you might corroborate the alternative version of events that you put forward, and there's no corroboration for that. In effect, what you're saying is the evidence that's been presented to us is untrue. Now, why would Jeff Aberdeen, a very senior person in the history of the SNP, now pursuing a career in financial services, as you're aware, why would he give evidence that was untrue? I've
not heard or seen Jeff's own evidence, and I'm very conscious of that. I am not, you know, all of these people, and you know, this will be a feature of much of our discussion today. You're talking about, you know, personal relationships that go back a long time. You know, the people we're talking about here, I have worked with and known and considered friends for a long time. I'm not here to, you know, cast aspersions on anybody's, you know, bona fides or sincerity here, but clearly there are differing recollections and differing accounts. I can speak more clearly about the accounts or the conversations I was part of. I am telling you what my understanding is of a conversation I was not part of. And in terms of, you know, clearly a couple of things, people who, and you know this because you're a lawyer, people who are told about something that happened in a conversation that is not necessarily, they were not part of that, that is hearsay evidence. In terms of who corroborates on the part of the, you have to look at the bigger picture. And what I'm saying to you here is I can think of why the name of a complainant might have been known at that time. that does not mean it was revealed or identified in the way that has been said. And I'm not going to repeat everything I've said about the 2nd of April, but Mr Salmond knew the identity of both complainers in one case because, as he told me, he had apologised to her. That's my recollection of how he knew that complainer, and the other because he'd done his own investigations to find out.
But, I mean, you're absolutely right, First Minister. We do not have evidence in front of us from Jeff Aberdeen. But we have evidence in front of us from both Duncan Hamilton and from Kevin Pringle, both saying that he told them this version of events. So either they're not telling us the truth, or the senior official you refer to is not telling the truth.
Look, I don't think I can go much further than I already have on this. I keep saying it's not for me to tell the committee how to do its work, but it is open to the committee to speak to the two people who were party to this discussion in private to try to get a sense of, you know, is there a direct clash of recollection or is there a misunderstanding in what actually happened?
Okay.
Mr Fraser, could you be quick? I'm very aware of the timing to refresh this room.
Just one final question, Convener. I mean, this is clearly a very serious matter, because there are very serious claims that have been made here about the release of a complainant's name, which apart from anything else would be illegal under GDPR. It's a breach of privacy and potentially a criminal act for which we have corroborated statements from witnesses alleging it has taken place. Have you had this matter investigated in the Scottish Government?
Look, these are matters that are under investigation by this committee, by an independent advisor.
No, I'm talking about the police. Are the police investigating this? And if not, why not?
I am not aware of the police investigating that. I don't instruct the police, contrary to some suggestions that have been made. So
but with respect, First Minister, as head of the Scottish Government, do you not have a responsibility to protect the privacy of complainants who work within the Scottish Government who have made complaints?
Yeah.
And the allegation, a very serious allegation has been made here about the release of a complainant's name, which is a criminal act. Surely you, as head of the government, should be taking action on that.
I am trying to respect the processes that are already underway into these things, this committee and the inquiry into the Ministerial Code. These are matters that are being considered by both of those, and I, rightly or wrongly, Mr Fraser, and people can draw their own conclusions from that, but rightly and wrongly, I am trying to allow these processes to run their course. The police do not need my authority to investigate any matter that they wish to investigate.
Mr Wightman, you've assured me this is a very short supplementary, so please make it so.
It is, just to confirm in the ICO, so the review of the decision by the Criminal Investigation Team, which was reported to Levy and McCrae on the 20th May 2020, says at paragraph 4.8, there remains the possibility that the leak came from elsewhere. The list of stakeholders who had access to the internal misconduct investigation report includes the original complainants, the QC, the First Minister's Principal Private Secretary, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and Mr Salmond and Levy and McCrae, as well as relevant staff members of the SG. So it appears from the Information Commissioner's report that the First Minister's Principal Private Secretary did have a copy of the internal misconduct investigation report. I think you said previously that your office had not got a copy.
So my understanding, and I think my Principal Private Secretary has written to the committee on this, is that that is a misapprehension from the internal government investigation into this, that he did not get sent, my office did not get sent the decision report. If there's further clarification we can usefully provide on that, we will do. But I did not get sent the decision report, and my office did not get sent the decision report.
Okay, and finally, the kind of leak of the name of a complainer, or indeed the leak of a decision report, anyone in Scottish Government who did leak or make public or communicate to third parties such information, that would be a dismissal offence, wouldn't it, fairly clearly?
I would imagine so, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone, and in line with the agreed mitigations to allow us to meet safely in person today, I will suspend this session for around 20 minutes, so we will reconvene at 11:35. Can I remind members and everyone else to observe social distancing when leaving the committee room and during the break, and I now suspend this session.